Hi, I'm Heidi Fairborn. Welcome to my presentation today about the juvenile justice population, specifically environmental and cultural factors that affect their health. We'll begin today by talking about the cultural environment, specifically media. So media has really not done anybody in the juvenile justice system any favors. They've really typically portrayed them as being heartless, dangerous, but most importantly, non-white. In 1995, the term super predator was coined and it began getting a lot of media attention. Now, what's really interesting is that at this time, juvenile crime was actually declining. However, after that term was coined, there was an uptick in what was seen as juvenile crime. So super predators were characterized as these people, specifically non-white people, who put zero value in the lives of their victims, and they saw them as worthless white trash. But in reality, the dehumanization was happening against the non-white youth who were having a greater risk of being put in the detention centers and the juvenile justice system, and they were having a much higher risk of being understood. The next cultural environment we'll talk about is family support. So there's lots of studies out there that indicate the link between family difficulties and juvenile crime. Traditionally, families will provide things like safety, security, and support for their children, but when that is there or it's weak, children are left to parent themselves, which often leads them to make poor and desperate decisions. This can really have a negative impact on their long-term health. We'll move on to the role of peers. So if you can think back to being a teen, you'll remember that peer acceptance and peer support was absolutely huge. But unfortunately, this population has a lot of mental illness and substance abuse, and friends can either help or hinder the recovery from these types of challenge. Detention is unique in that youth can spend hours to years within that system, or they may enter and exit frequently. So peers is it's kind of a difficult term, but I would say that it would be anybody who is living the same experience, whether inside or outside of a detention center. And the peer norms, the attitudes, the behaviors and beliefs, and peer pressure will have a huge impact on whether or not a youth seeks treatment or help for mental illness or substance abuse disorders, or if it is perpetuated. Let's talk about this cyclical nature of youth entering and exiting and entering the juvenile justice system. So intergenerational crime is very common. It is not uncommon to see people who are admitted to detention where their parents or grandparents or siblings are also serving time in jails or prisons. Children with one or both of an incarcerated parent are especially disadvantaged. Sometimes they grow up not knowing these parents, or they just live in a specifically violent family or community or area that makes violence or drug abuse or working or living within the juvenile justice system, it's a normal thing for them. So, and then when youth leave the detention centers, they find it really difficult to integrate back into a safe and a healthy society, because the world that they are living in at home is a world that is going to put them back into the juvenile justice system repetitively. So as much as they reform or change inside detention, once they go back outside to the support system of their family, it spits them back in to JJS. Next, we'll talk about the legal and political systems. So there's a whole bunch of working pieces that are within this part of the system. So you've got courts, judges, police officers, detention centers, and the laws all vary city by city, state by state, and on an international level, country by country. There was a particularly horrible account that I read about from a researcher, and she titled her piece "Hell on Earth." And there's an anecdote in there about a boy who was charged with grand larceny for allegedly stealing a backpack. He was kept in solitary confinement for almost 2 years waiting for his trial, which in the end never happened because the courts said that there wasn't even enough evidence to try the case. And this boy ended up committing suicide because he could not overcome the mental and physical demons that were bestowed upon him when he was in solitary confinement. So there's that perspective. And then there's also the perspective that we'll talk about later, where there are now many, many laws being written trying to keep kids out of detention, out of jail, because we know that putting kids in detention or jail opens up just this huge world of problems that if we can keep them outside of it, doing home detention or anything outside of a locked facility, it will help them in the long run. Potential barriers, we've got 100,000 youth in custody in the year 2000. Today, there's roughly 50,000 in custody. And that is related to what I was talking about before, movements and research and laws that have been written to keep kids out of jail. But social stigmas still exist, barriers still exist. The racial disparity among incarcerated adults is going down. This is a good thing. However, the racial disparity among incarcerated youth is rising. Specifically, minorities are still tending to show a higher prevalence than their white peers. Let's talk about the international scope. So the Global Youth Wellbeing Index provides some insight. They looked at 30 countries, which is definitely not an exhaustive list. But the best countries were Australia, Sweden, and South Korea. The worst countries were Tanzania, Uganda, and Nigeria. It's interesting to note that 8 of the 11 lowest ranking countries are in Africa. They didn't really give note to why. It's just interesting to note. And US ranks 6 on this list. Health disparities. So first we're going to talk about socioeconomic status. Youth in detention centers often are coming from families with low socioeconomic status. The juvenile justice system can impose fines for crimes committed. There's fees for lawyers, and the better lawyer you get, hopefully, the less time you will have to do. Lots of these kids don't have lawyers because lots of these families don't have money for lawyers. And then we'll also talk about immigration on the next slide. So, race. In 2002 to 2004, Black Americans made up just 16% of the American youth under 18, but they constituted 28% of juvenile arrests, 37% of youth in detention, and 58% of youth admitted to adult prisons. Additionally, Latino immigrants are very much at risk for being put into the JJS system. In 2019, the Border Patrol put 70,000 kids in detention centers. I'm not trying to make this political. These are just numbers. But because these detention centers were inundated with kids that they were not expecting or equipped to handle, a lot of these kids lacked the health care and the education which detention centers are required to provide by law, which could create a health disparity for them. Religion is an interesting topic. Youth in detention centers are allowed by law to practice their religion unless it is threatening to the facility or those in the facility. There really isn't any indication that religion would affect their health differently versus other youth the same age who are not involved in the juvenile justice system. But it has been proven that religious education can be instrumental in improving adolescent mental health. Let's talk gender. So the juvenile justice system is highly gendered, and it is a gendering environment. Much of the gendering in JJS is unintentional. However, that's talking about like attitudes towards gender. Youth are kept in separate areas in locked facilities, boys in one area, girls in another, in the places that I work. So a big exception for this would be the LGBTQ programming, which can be very intentional as they try to work with these youth. So, but it does happen. Unconsciously reinforcing traditional masculinity or femininity can be helpful or hurtful depending on how you perceive it. If you're teaching somebody to be manly and protect the weak in that traditional gender norm, it could be helpful, or it could also mean let's get girls pregnant. So it depends on how it is taught and how it is perceived for gender. Geographical location. So after-school programs are an example of support for disadvantaged families based upon geographical location. What's interesting is California ranks number 1 for after-school programming, but Arizona has the highest number of low-income families. Tennessee has got 52% of the low-income children. That is definitely not in California, but good for California. Vermont ranks 8th in parental satisfaction, but it has the lowest percentage of low-income children participation, only 14%. So it seems that we're trying, but there is a bit of a disconnect between who really needs it and who's getting the help. Bias, implicit bias. So when juveniles are arrested, it is the prosecuting attorney that decides whether or not to submit a petition to the court. In Michigan, there was found to be a pretty obvious implicit bias where prosecutors were petitioning the court for a much larger percentage of Black offenders versus white offenders. Explicit bias, hopefully nobody is explicitly biased, but it does happen. But an example of this is when people who are hiring these youth, they'll require background checks. And on that background check, they're required to report specific things. And that could be an explicit bias for them to become hired or not hired. The international scope, the last thing we'll talk about. So Sweden is a great example of doing things hopefully a little bit better than the US. So it's a world leader in rehabilitating incarcerated individuals, young and old. Sweden has universal health care, meaning that lower income families don't have to choose between paying for health care or other expenses. Compared to the US has 1 in 109 adults in prison. Comparing that to Sweden, we've got 1 in 2,278. So they've got much less numbers of incarcerated adults. The Swedish National Board of Institutional Care has prioritized trauma therapy at the center for their interventions, which is fantastic. Serving as a nurse in the JJS system, I think that trauma therapy is a must. They do get therapy, but it is not specifically trauma therapy, and that could be helpful. So Sweden is really just an example of the international disparities. And we talked about earlier how many countries in Africa are doing much worse, and US is more middle of the board and Sweden is a little bit higher. So there's a lot of variety there when it comes to international scope. Well, these are my references, and hopefully you enjoyed the presentation and learned a few things about youth who are in the juvenile justice system. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening.